Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Yissel Missile Productions channel. My name is Steven Yissel, and today we are continuing our deep dive into Ed Leedskalnin and his Coral Castle. We'll be reading from his book here, that was put together by Rusty McClure and Jack Heffron, that covers his time in life working on this castle in Florida. So we're picking up from where we left off last time, and this segment will be covering chapters 2 and 3. So I guess without further ado, we'll get started. Um, First few things, just want to double check everything's running smoothly here on YouTube, and glad that you're all here. I see there's a few of you here already. That's excellent. So yeah, I guess we'll get going. We'll get this thing rolling right here, right now. So yeah, if you guys haven't watched the last one, I've covered the introduction and chapter 1, and it went into Ed's early life and his time living in Latvia and how he came to the United States and the reasons why he came to the United States. And had a few pictures here. One that I did not show just yet. Um, this one, it says immigrants. Um, Wish this would focus again. Not doing too good with that. This is around 1912 though. It says immigrants sail into the port of New York, circa 1912. All right, so we're going to start with chapter 2 here. And we also we have to get the pictures up here too. Dang it. I hope you're all doing well out there. We are doing well here on the channel. Just trying to keep this consistent day in and day out, or week in and week out, I should rather say. But all right. So yeah, we'll be reading from here shortly. Okay. We got we got the photo up. All right. Okay, so chapter 2, Wandering America. On March 23rd, 1912, Edward Leedskalnin, in the company of two companions, Ernst Warcel and Bertha Schmidt, boarded the ocean liner SS Pennsylvania, departing out of Hamburg, Germany, bound for New York City. Hamburg was one of Northern Europe's main ports, a primary departure point for the peoples of many European countries and their voyage to America. As Ed waited, the crowd around him chattered in German, Russian, Polish, Hungarian, and other languages, a din of confusion and excitement, sad partings, and final farewells. They stood bundled up in heavy coats, the men wearing bowler hats, the women swaddled in shawls, some holding babies, others urging their children to stay close so they didn't get lost in the crowd. Most photographs we have of Ed were taken in his later years. In these pictures, he appears skinny, even gaunt, wearing a stern look on his face. Dressed in a dark suit and tie, his posture as rigid as post. He looks dour, forbidding, and even a little bit scary. Not at all a man one. Okay, okay, hold on. Not at all a man would want to spend time with, much less marry. So we got more pictures here on the next page. This is the port of Hamburg, Germany, from which Ed embarked on his voyage to America. A nice little picture. And then the SS Pennsylvania carried Ed across the ocean. So this boat at one point in time brought Ed to America here. A photo of him from right around the time of his voyage to America, however, reveals an entirely different aspect of Ed's personality. In this picture, Ed is wearing a sporty bowler and tie, a thin mustache, and a look of shrewd confidence. He looks quite the continental character, quite the enterprising young man. And no wonder, at the time his life was open to new and tremendous possibilities. Life in America would be different for him. Hard work and resourcefulness, rather than the class into which you were born, determined the level of success a person could achieve. Success in business, in one's personal, and one's romantic life. No one in America would reject Ed for what, rather than who, he was. As he left for the New World on that cold March day, he must have been brimming with hope about his future in the new land. The information on the passenger list gives us our first documented glimpse of Edward Leedskalnin, spelt Letzkalin. And that's a little bit different of a spelling and pronunciation. I've been saying, uh, what is it? Leedskalninch is really the way that you would pronounce his Latvian name. So if you see me adding the cinch or ninch at the end of his last name, that's why. I'm not necessarily mispronouncing it. I'm pronouncing it the way that it existed originally. So, all right, we'll continue on reading here. Okay, so the information on the passenger list gives us our first documented glimpse of Edward Leedskalnin, which is how he spelled his name on the manifest. The information he provided illuminates and in one case contradicts basic tenets of the Leedskalnin legend as it has developed through the years. Ed states that he is 25 years old. He is able to read and write and is in good health. He writes that he is 5 foot 6 inches tall, a claim emphatically contradicted by people who knew him later in life. We used to call him, so there's a quote here, quote, we used to call him Mr. Leprechaun because he was so small, end quote, stated Florida City resident Charlotte Schmunk. Quote, he was tiny. I kind of looked down to him a little bit, unquote, said Petite Ruth Campbell, a resident of Homestead and the curator at the historical Homestead Town Hall Museum. Bang. Quote, he was a little man, end quote, concurred Francis Boysen, another Homestead resident who once ate Thanksgiving dinner with Ed at the home of a relative. The height that is listed, either Ed's claim or the estimate of the government clerk then, seems like an exaggeration, given that Ed's real height, according to his neighbors, was closer to 5 feet tall. And you could definitely see that in the photos here. Oh, we're gonna have to look at that other one. But this is a photo with me, with his cardboard cutout, and I'm pretty sure they did a 1-to-1 scale uh printout of this. So that is more realistic to how tall he was. I'm 5'9", and that does not look like 5'6", and from other accounts said that he is in fact 5 foot tall. So uh yeah, there's that. And my apologies for not going through all these. This is a really nice panoramic I took. I'll just give you a second to. All right. So this is looking kind of south, and or actually, this is all like it's a full 360 because it comes back around. So this would be looking west, this wall. Out back here would be north, up to about here. Over here is east, the eastern wall of the castle. And then back here, this is the southern portion of the castle. And we'll also zoom in on some of this too. But just want to give you a new image to look at here. That was me taking a closer picture of the building in the back. There the people there were talking, this is back in 2023 of February. They were talking about that they were considering purchasing that building and tearing it down. And I agree. I think that would be really a good investment because then you'll open this up. You won't have that. I don't know what era building that is. It must be like 70s or 80s. But yeah, if you get rid of that, it'd look open it up a bit more with the green foliage. I think that's what they were planning on doing with that once it was done. We'll get into more of what we're looking at here because it's in the book. So a lot of this will be explained. I forget portions of this too and what he was doing here. And yeah, we'll just look at it as we go here. I'm gonna take a break from reading so I can check on here to see who's watching, and then we'll just jump right back in. No worries. Yeah, I hope you're all doing well today. All right. And yeah, a lot of this, so he made this his home. He lived here. He built all of these different areas. They all had a purpose for his daily life. And he built it up anticipating his long lost love that ran away from the altar would return and be so impressed by the place that she'd turn around from her fear of marrying him and marry him then. So that was a big motivator for him. All right, we are ready to continue reading. All right. So the height that is listed, either Ed's claim or the estimate of the government clerk, then seems like an exaggeration, given that Ed's real height, according to his neighbors, was closer to 5 feet tall. In filling out the documents required for his passage to America, Ed listed himself as, quote, landman, comma, Tagalloner. That's spelled Taglelohner, end quote. A landsman who works for daily wages, a day laborer. He listed his nationality as Russian, his race as Lithuanian, not as much of a contradiction as it may seem, because although Lithuania is located south of Latvia in the Baltic region, the areas share so much in common culturally, and the languages are very similar. His family, in fact, may have had its roots in the Lithuanian region. He also stated on the passenger list that he was carrying $80, considerably more than typical immigrants brought with them, according to genealogist Sharon DiBartolo Carmack. Most immigrants had around $25 on them, she said. So he had 80 and the average was 25. Quote, so anything more than that is a lot, end quote. According to the Consumer Price Index, his $80 in 1912 would be equal to a little more than $1,800 today. So that also goes in and tells you what's wrong with the fiat dollar. And we'll be talking a lot more about that here on this channel, but we will not be today. But that's just a short example of just how out of control of the fiat dollar is. Not a four, so it's 1,800 today. Of the $80 that he brought is worth 1,800 if it were to be converted into today's money. Not a fortune by a long shot, but certainly enough to support Ed until he found work in America. Perhaps Ed had been saving his money for the pending nuptials with Agnes, or perhaps his family pooled resources to help him on his way. And I actually think that might be more of the case, where he was gifted money, but it could have been his own money or somebody, a friend, or maybe someone else that he knew helped him out. So, regardless of how much money he had, it is more than likely that Ed, given his station in life and his pecuniary ways, took a berth in third class steerage. Passengers in steerage usually brought their own food, cured meats, fish, pickles, cheese, and the air would have been redolent with those smells for each hour of the 16-day crossing. So they're just saying that's how it would be smelling the whole entire time while they were coming over. The ocean in March would have been choppy with storms and winds as well, and many of the passengers would have been seasick, at least for the initial portion of the voyage. The Pennsylvania, unlike the new ocean liners being built at the time, such as the White Star Line's Titanic, which sank a week after Ed arrived at the port of New York, was not built for luxury. And Titanic's another one. Titanic's another deep dive to get into because I don't believe it was originally the ship named the Titanic. And there's more that you could research about that to look into it because there's an identical ship. Okay, so on April 7th, 1912, the ship arrived in New York at Ellis Island, the gateway to the New World. Ed and his companions, Warcel and Schmidt, in the papers they filed out, or the papers they filled out, gave New Brunswick, New Jersey as their final destination. They were headed, in fact, to Berta Schmidt's home, where Bert, or Berth, yeah, where Bertha's husband, Robert, who was also Ernst's cousin, awaited them. I think there is a few typos in the book, and I'm also not, I'm doing my own rendition here because I'm reading. So I'm not reading word for word from this book, but I'm doing it as much as possible. And if I mess up a certain sentence, I'll just continue moving on. So just for the sake of flow here. So, all right, we'll continue. Though Latvians had been immigrating to the US for many years, and their numbers swelled with those who arrived in the wake of the 1905 uprising, they never came in large enough numbers to establish a strong presence in any one place. Unlike the Italians and Poles, who created their own neighborhoods in the industrial cities of the East, or the Scandinavians, who settled in the upper Midwest, Latvians never settled in concentrations large enough to provide a place where new arrivals like Ed could settle in and feel at home, could prosper from a network of countrymen who had already established connections in America. For whatever reason, he didn't stay long in New Jersey. In August of 1912, he crossed the border into Canada. From documentation he would later fill out, We know that during the 4 months he spent in the US after his arrival, he lived in various states. Eventually, he decided the grass would be greener, so to speak, in the Pacific Northwest. This is a quote, as far as opportunities for manual labor, it would have been one of the best places to go, says Robert Ficken, author of The Forested Land, A History of Lumbering in Western Washington. Quote, thousands of people were going there every year. When you got here, getting a job would have been simple. And there's two photos. One says Ed was processed through the famous immigration center at Ellis Island in New York, shown here and on the next page. So we got two photos. Uh, Stop the screen share here so you can see this in large. So this is a photo from Ellis Island, and this is just a general picture showing where he would have walked through and been processed at the time. And that was 1912. All right, let's get that picture back up, and then we will continue. Hey, Brenda, I see you now. Okay, so I'm going to change the picture here, and then we will continue on. Okay. By this point in the new century, the focus of the lumbering industry had shifted from the upper Midwest to the Pacific Northwest, where huge forests of cedar, fir, pine, and spruce blanketed the region. Ed started his search for work in Cranbrook, British Columbia, a town in the Canadian Rockies, about 35 miles from the American border. Cranbrook, an important stop along the Canadian Pacific Railway, was the population and transportation center of the mountainous East Kootenay district. He only stayed 4 months, crossing back into America at the town of Eastport, Ohio, Idaho, on January 9th, 1913. On papers filed on papers filled out for that crossing, he listed Spokane, Washington as his final destination. Wow, that's stuff I didn't know about Colorado. There's two photos here. So the first photo is loggers in the Northwest during the time that Ed worked there. And then the second picture is life in the Northwest logging industry during the early 20th century was often difficult, dirty, and dangerous. So these are just showing what these looked like during the time he was there. So I really appreciate these authors putting all of this together so we get a sense of how everything was back in that time. I'll get the picture back up and we'll continue on. Okay, on the papers filled out for that crossing, he listed Spokane, Washington as his final destination. He also listed himself as 5'9". Again, I am 5'9". I am 5'9". So he's embellishing a bit. Not sure why. I mean, people have that insecurity sometimes. Okay, here we continue now. In those days, Spokane was a major rail hub and was a key transportation link to the Northwest from all points east. Ed would have arrived there to find chaos similar to the kind he'd witnessed back in Hamburg, a roil of passengers hustling from one platform to the next, the urgent call of porters announcing all aboard. Only this time, since he spoke little English, the crush of people and the sounds of sights around him must have seemed not only strange and exotic, but maybe even a little frightening. Ed was all alone, half a world away from his home, his family, from even a single familiar friendly face. He would spend the next 10 years of his life that way. The next hard evidence we have of Ed's movements comes from his draft registration papers filled out on June 5th, 1917. By that time, he was living in Douglas County, Oregon, in the small town of Elkton. Required by law to register for the first national draft, Ed claimed exemption because he was the subject of a foreign country. He still had not applied for citizenship, and one wonders if he planned to return to Latvia sometime in the future. A few months before Ed went to register for the draft, the Tsar had been deposed in the Russian Revolution. One wonders if Ed still harbored feelings about an independent Latvia and if he was, perhaps, tempted to return. On the card, Ed declared that he was employed by himself and that his occupation was axe handle manufacturer, a supplier of tools for the logging industry rather than a logger or mill worker. Physically, Ed described himself as slender, with blue eyes and light brown hair. He also, in response to a question on the form regarding height, tall, medium, or short, please specify, in parentheses, described himself as one of medium height. By January of 1920, he had left Elkton and moved even farther west to the coastal town of Reedsport, Oregon, home of the newly founded Reedsport Lumber Company. According to papers he filled out for the 1920 census, Ed lived in rented property there with a man named Clement Somers. Somers was a native of Oregon and worked in one of the Reedsport lumber mills, as did Ed at the time, but not too, but not for too much longer. Quote, it was a young man's job, end quote, says Robert Ficken. Quote, the conditions were rough. You could get badly hurt or killed. It was dangerous work, exasperated by the employers who were always trying to get as much production as possible from the workers. If you were injured, there was no unemployment insurance, no social security, no welfare. If you put in 8 years of hard work in the woods, you'd come out a much older man than your years. End quote. By the early 1920s, Ed was in his 30s and ready to move on from the logging industry and from the Northwest as well. The weather was cold and wet much of the time. The work days were 10 to 12 hours long, and loggers worked those days in damp clothes, indoors and out. Filth and disease were rampant. At some point, as Ed would later tell his neighbors, he got sick. He decided to go someplace warm, where he could have a fresh start, find an opportunity that held greater promise. His immediate movements after Reedsport, though, remained somewhat of a mystery. Some sources say that Ed moved next to California, perhaps for the sunnier climate. Some say that while there, he met a rancher who hired him to drive a herd of his cattle back to Texas. Ed would later tell his Florida neighbors that during these years he bought stock in some utility companies, the dividends from which supplied him with money for the rest of his life. And I wouldn't highly doubt that at all. The truth about Ed's wandering years is difficult, if not impossible, to know for certain. In 1923, Ed showed up in Florida City, Florida, intending at last to put down roots, to build himself a home. First, however, there was a concern about that illness he'd caught in the logging camps, which in the intervening years had worsened. The disease, according to many, was tuberculosis. which in those days often amounted to a death sentence. It is at this point in Edward Leedskalnin's life that the few facts we do have begin to be colored by myth. The story of his wanderings and his achievements begin to move from reality into the realm of the unbelievable. We've finished chapter 2. I'm going to get out of the screen share real quick. All right. So we're going to be reading chapter 3 as well. There is a picture here that I'm going to show now. It says Ed stands at Ed's place in the late 1920s. And so he had already been building this coral castle. It's a sharp-dressed man, right? Looks sharper than me. I gotta get a new suit. All right, so we'll read chapter 3, and that'll be it for today. And next week we'll carry on with chapters 4 and 5. But for now, we will begin chapter 3. Building a castle. In 1922, the Miami Herald was known for the heaviest newspaper in the US due to the number of land listings advertised in it. The 20s were boom years in Florida. From 1920 to 1925, the state's population more than doubled. When the whole towns grew up almost overnight and others doubled and tripled in size. Improved roads and a railroad line from New York to Florida brought newcomers seeking pleasure and prosperity by the thousands to the Sunshine State. Miami Beach, Boca Raton, Fort Lauderdale, West Palm Beach, and countless other towns rose up from the Florida soil to beckon eager vacationers south. Meanwhile, easy credit in the post-war economy attracted land speculators hoping to cash in on the promise of this lush warm weather wonderland. One of those men was a man named Reuben Moser, who in 1910, along with a number of neighbors and family members, left Topeka, Kansas for a chance to start fresh in the Sunshine State. Moser settled in the southernmost part of Florida, near 22,000-acre parcel that in 1913 was purchased by the Model Land Company of Detroit. The company quickly began a marketing effort that extolled the virtues of this tropical paradise to people in Michigan, going so far as to rename the parcel of land Detroit. You see that? I'm going to take a break here because I just want to make a point about this. Oh, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry for that screen share. I didn't mean to do it that way. But basically, yeah, these people were naming new new cities and town or new towns after existing towns to attract people to go there. And if you're not good with geography or maps and you show up, they're just gonna tell you that yeah, you're here. This is Detroit. But it's really Detroit, Florida, not Detroit, Michigan. All right. We are not going to enter the tunnel here. We are back onto a picture. And I got some more pictures from the book to show after this page. So some Michiganders took the bait and moved in. Those who did, however, quickly realized that the promotional brochures painted a far more attractive picture of the place than they found. Yep. Before long, most moved away. In 1914, portions of that development were incorporated under the name Florida City. Located on the eastern border of what is now Everglades National Park, approximately 30 miles southwest of Miami, it became the southernmost city in the United States not located on an island. That's pretty interesting. By that time, Reuben Moser had become a real estate agent as well as one of the area's most vocal ambassadors. An article in the August 6, 1914 Homestead Enterprise reported, quote, through Moser's untiring efforts and honest zeal, the Red Land District has become known to hundreds of people who might otherwise have been ignorant of the opportunities here, end quote. Thanks in part to Moser's efforts, by 1922, Florida City had gained a population of over 800 people. The city, according to the town's official website, quote, had a drugstore, a hardware store, and a three-story hotel. South of the town was the largest ice plant in the state and a lumber mill. However, most of the town's economy came from farming, end quote. At the time, or at some point while out driving during the winter of 1922 to 1923, Moser came across a man lying in a heap alongside the road. He helped him up, put him in the car, and brought him home. The man, Moser and his wife soon discovered, was seriously ill with some kind of respiratory disease. He was on the verge of dying. That man, of course, was Edward Leedskalnin. So we got the two pictures here I'll be showing you. The first picture is Florida City, Florida in the early 1920s, and the second picture is Florida City was a small farming community when Ed arrived. Those are the two uh, descriptions under them. So Florida City in the 1920s, see the vehicle there. And then more what basically it looks like a street with two, like a median here. See, there's a median, there's a road on the one side, and then there's grass and trees, and then another road. Seems like there's houses on either side. So very similar to what we have today. I mean, the whole Miami area pretty much has that distinct feature. A lot of more open areas, not as much concrete. And we will continue. I think I'm getting into some pictures that I have not shown yet. So uh, we will be seeing a lot more here, though. All right, let's continue. Ed had apparently arrived in Florida in the winter of 1922 to 1923. The weather was certainly milder than that of the Northwest. The sun must have felt good on his face, a welcome relief of the gray, damp days in Oregon. Instead of the tall Douglas firs towering under leaden skies, he saw palm trees and palmettos, fruit trees heavy with oranges and grapefruits, cypress, flowering camellias, and bougainvillea. I can't pronounce this. Bougainvillea. The Florida city he came to was an area made up of mostly small farms, undeveloped land, palm trees, scrub pine, and swamp. The state's economic boom did not extend as far south as Florida City. If Ed had journeyed to this part of the state looking to get in on the action, he was out of luck. He may, however, have had other reasons. But no one knows how long Ed traveled before Moser found him. So did Ed actually walk and walk and walk until he couldn't walk anymore, and because of the illness, it just made him incapacitated? That's rough. No one knows how long Ed traveled before Moser found him. Joe Bullard, the author of a fictional account of Ed's life titled Waiting for Agnes, heard a story that suggested Ed had been wandering for months. Bullard has appeared on a number of radio shows to discuss his years of research on Ed and Coral Castle. And after one appearance, he was contacted by a man who said Ed had walked a long way to get to Florida City. Bullard recalls the man telling him, quote, "My father was working in Jacksonville in a bank. He looked outside one day and saw this little guy walking along the road with a witching rod. And witching rod, you use those to look for water. He said the little guy seemed out of it and might need some help. He asked the little guy what he was doing, and the guy just said, 'When I find it, I'll know it.' When Ed became famous, my father saw his picture in the paper and said, 'That was the little guy on the road with the rod.'" So I'm gonna take a break here just to address this. Was he using a witching rod to look for a water source? Or was he using a witching rod to look for some other geographical phenomenon? I gotta ask that question because it's credible enough, seeing as what he built here. Okay. The rod, according to some, was a witching or dowsing rod, believed capable of determining the presence of water or so-called, quote, energy within the earth. Well, there we go. Local people who knew Ed often mentioned that he was very aware of water tables and talked about them frequently. This is the first known mention of Ed being guided by what some term, quote, supernatural forces. The first public documentation of Ed's arrival in Florida City appeared in the February 27th, 1923 edition of Homestead Enterprise, the local newspaper. It offered a short, straightforward statement. Quote, "E. Leedskalnin, a Californian, has purchased an acre of the R.L. Moser homestead and is planning to erect a home soon." End quote. The paper didn't mention the miraculous recovery that Ed had made from the often fatal disease he had caught. In her book titled The Villages of South Dade, historian Jean Taylor wrote that, quote, "One day Reuben Moser brought home Edward Leedskalnin, a 97-pound Latvian immigrant who was seriously ill. Mrs. Moser fixed a room and a tool shed for him and nursed him until he recovered." End quote. There are those who believe that statement contains the whole truth of the matter. As one of Ed's neighbors would later recall, quote, "He told me that he was unable to work was why he came here, that he had a lung condition, and the climate cured him and made him so strong and healthy." End quote. These people believe that after living in the Moser's tool shed for a few weeks, sitting in the sunshine and resting, and enjoying the ministrations of Francis Moser and Lois, the Moser's teenage daughter, Ed started to regain his strength and feel better. Tuberculosis, if that is indeed what Ed was suffering from, is an infectious disease caused by airborne bacteria. Its symptoms usually include chronic coughing, fever, and weight loss. It was not curable in the early 1920s. Significant progress in the treatment of the disease, in fact, was not made until 1946 with the success of the antibiotic streptomycin. A common treatment for the disease at the time was exposure to ultraviolet rays gotten from sunlight. Moving to Florida, he may have been Ed's last-ditch effort to heal himself. He counted on the weathers, on the warm sun of Florida to cure him, and it did. Others believe the story is not that simple. According to another neighbor, Ed's disease was far too serious to be cured by simple sunlight. Quote, "He went to see Dr. B.F. Ekman, who examined him and told him that his health was in such a condition that he could not live for more than 6 months. He told Ed to get fresh air and do the things he wanted to do." end quote. The doctor, in other words, gave Ed a death sentence. 3 years later, that same doctor called on Ed and was, in the neighbor's words, quote, so surprised to find the fellow, he said, could live such a short while, end quote. Sunlight does not qualify as an answer to the riddle of Ed's miracle cure. How then did he manage to survive? Never mind thrive, and find the strength to build his coral castle? Yeah, that's a good question. For nearly 30 more years. Some theorists suggest that he cured himself through a unique understanding of electromagnetism, which he would then later write about in great detail. They suggest that this magnet therapy, in combination with the healing effect of the sun's ultraviolet rays, led to Ed's miraculous recovery. This is where we're getting into the good stuff. Joe Bullard, among others, believes that Ed's tuberculosis remained a lifelong problem for him and that he continued to use this type of therapy. Bullard suggests Ed lay out in the sun while wrapped in a cable attached to a power generator to give him magnetic treatments to continue to fight the disease. The castle today still includes what Ed called his sun couch, a circular stone on which he lay to take in the warm and healing rays. So where is this sun couch? I should have it here. But there's also a lot of chairs that he built in here too. All right, we'll continue on. However, he cured himself by winter's end. Ed had made enough of a recovery to leave the Mosers' home. And shortly thereafter, he bought an unlikely parcel of land from Reuben Moser, 2 acres located in a remote area, unsuited for any type of commercial enterprise. 2 acres completely unsuited for farming. 2 acres whose topsoil barely covered a foundation of coral rock that ran hundreds of feet below the surface. He apparently took a long time to find those 2 acres. As Gene Taylor wrote, Leedskalnin searched the whole neighborhood for land which met his requirements, end quote. And what were those requirements? Edward Leedskalnin wanted to build himself a home, and the kind of rock that lay underneath Reuben Moser's 2 acres was perfect for his desires. In 1955, half a decade after Ed's death, the new owners of the home he had spent his life building hired a woman named Bodil Kozel as a publicity agent. Their intent was to document the unbelievable, while such documentation was still possible. To have in hand affidavits, sworn testimony that would attest to the truth that the 1,100 tons of coral that comprised Edward Leedskalnin's home had been quarried, raised, cut, and lain in place by him and him alone. Lowe spent from April through September of that year gathering those affidavits from 285 local residents in all, as well as accompanying commentary, after which Lowe, a notary public, affixed her seal. The documents they signed states, and it says, so it's not really in a quote. So this is reading from what the document would have said to whoever signed these affidavits. That blank, and you put your name on there, personally knew the late Edward Leedskalnin and from actual knowledge can attest to the fact that the said Edward Leedskalnin began the construction of Rock Gate at a location in Florida City, Florida, on or about the year 1921, and subsequently moved some of the objects to its present location and continued to work until his death in December 1951. That he cut from the ground, moved, and carved the huge weights of coral rock into the art creation known as Rock Gate without the aid of any individual or individuals. That the tools found presently on the premises are the identical and same observed by the affiant on visits to Rockgate while Edward Leedskalnin was alive and in the process of constructing Rockgate, and that the said Edward Leedskalnin was unmarried and lived alone on the premises during the period of construction of Rockgate and until his death. So that actually was, I'm going to pause right here. So that actually was something that came up on the tour that we all took while watching uh, this tour guide show us around. Or actually, no, before the tour guide, we watched a video that was like a mini documentary, and he moved these rocks from one location to this present location. So he started building it somewhere else, and he had called it Rock Gate, and then he moved it from it. Well, he moved it from Florida City over to Homestead. And so like a lot of people were theorizing, how did he move it? And a few of them said he had horses bring it in on carriages, rock by rock, like piece by piece. But on the location in Homestead, there is coral rock there as well. So whatever he previously built, he also brought over to this location, which contained even more of this coral rock. So I'm going to screen share again, and then we will continue this final chapter for today of chapter 3. These papers provided the best glimpse of not just Coral Castle's construction, but of Ed's early years in Florida City. From the affidavits, quote, in 1925, we saw Ed with his chains and tools working away on his project, the most amazing achievement, end quote. And that is from Mrs. C.L. Greenlands. Quote, this is to certify that I knew Edward Leedskalnin from 1921 until the time of his death. I was often a visitor at the original location and often talked to him as a true friend, end quote. And that is S.L. Shields. Quote, I have known the above Edward Leedskalnin for 30 years and have spent many hours of my youth with old Ed, watching him with a hammer and chisel working on solid rock. And I know for a fact that the above statements are true, end quote. That is from L.O. Cloninger Sr. And then there's one more quote here. Quote, I knew Ed since 1924. I was his shoemaker and often came, or I was his shoemaker and he often came to my shop, and I was always very interested in him and his work. I thought it was grand that a little lightweight man could undertake and do what he did, and I saw it with my own eyes. He told me he came to Florida as he was sick in the north, and he felt better living here. End quote. And that was from David Frederick. And on they go. Most laud Ed as a gentle, genial man. So I'm just going to make a note here that those were just four different accounts out of a total of 285 confirming that Ed did, in fact, live and build this location up. So, as far as documenting purposes, it's very important. Most laud Ed as a gentle, genial man. They shed light on both his personality and his early friendships with his neighbors. They speak of visiting his place on tours, for picnics and church socials, and of seeing him in town or riding his bike. The affidavits, though, cannot capture the curiosity their signers must have felt upon seeing the little European man new to the area as he began what would be his life's work. From the start, according to most, he remained elusive. He worked during the night, by moonlight, by lantern. Stories circulated of his keen hearing, his unusual sensitivity. Ed seemed somehow to know when he was being watched. Local resident MC Bardsley can still recall the time that her mother took the family to the castle site late in the evening in hopes of catching a glimpse of Ed at work. Quote, he only worked in the dead of the night, and everybody knew that. Quote, she said. Quote, my mother was pretty sneaky. She was trying to prove that we could watch what was happening because to her, that was part of history. End quote. Bardsley, laughing at the memory, adds that the investigation was unsuccessful. Quote, we just sat in the car and watched, and nothing happened. About 4 o'clock, mother took us home. We were there for about 5 hours. End quote. Others found the process far less mysterious. While their affidavits agree that Ed did not work, hold on, sorry. While their affidavits agree that Ed did the work himself, there is no mystery to some as to how he did it. Quote, during the time I was attending Homestead High School, studying a course in general science, our instructor took the entire class to Edward Leedskalnin's place in Florida City so that Mr. Leedskalnin could show the class how he could cut these huge rocks from the ground and how he by himself lifted them out of the ground and stood them in place with the aid of simple block and tackle rigs and long pry poles. The class was studying weights and the methods of moving articles with a minimum of effort. This was about 1930, end quote. And that's from T.A. Zajim, who was the assistant postmaster. And here's another quote. He showed us how he used pine logs to lift rocks. He would tie one end while he placed another wedge, keep this up until he got the piece on wooden rollers and moved where he shaved pieces with a hatchet. End quote. And that's from David Friedrich. So there's something else I'd like to mention here before we continue on. I have a suspicion here that yes, Ed did learn some technique while logging where he caught his tuberculosis, but when he was out there working in the forest, I think they had specific ways they found out how to move boulders out of the area that they were logging in. And this is one of the ways that he did all of this work, just one of the ways. So, uh, some of these other rocks are just immensely huge, and for him to do this on his own is pretty incredible. But I do think he learned a little something from his time, um, what out west. So we're gonna continue on here. Quote, as a boy in the 1920s, about 1928 or 1929, I was a neighbor of Edward Leedskalnin, and I saw him dig out and raise the large moonstone and set it up, the map of Florida stone, and several of the rocking chairs. When he was digging out the high, slender stone with a star top that weighs 18 tons, I well remember he broke the first two stones. This is that stone. So he broke the first two before successfully bringing this one up. It was on his third try that he patiently quarried the masterpiece that still stands today. In the beginning of his quarrying operation of each stone, he would dig a ditch about 18 inches wide all around his desired shape. He then would drive lots of wedges all around the stone and break it loose. In prying the stone out of the hole, he would use a small telephone pole. If that stone, or if that wasn't strong enough, he would connect another pole using steel band straps. If the second pole extension was not sufficient to pry it out, he would attach buckets to the end and fill them with pieces of iron. End quote. And that's from Earl S. Lee. In his book, Mr. Cant is Dead, Orville Irwin, who may have known Ed better than any of his Florida neighbors, describes the process step by step and even includes diagrams. Many people believe that Ed was able to build Coral Castle because he was a gifted engineer and stonemason. We know that he was trained as a stonemason in Latvia and possessed a mastery of the craft. We also know that he worked for a number of years in the logging industry in the Northwest, where enormous trees were cut down and then placed on various forms of conveyance before being shipped miles away. It's more than likely that through these years of experience, Ed learned the means of moving huge logs. We also know that Ed had a block and tackle as well as smaller pulleys and hoists, some of which still hang in the workshop on the first floor of the castle's tower. So let's show you a few of those. Several photos show Ed using a large tripod made from telephone poles with a block and tackle dangling in the middle that would allow him to lift a cut stone from the ground and pull it upright. One part of the story is indisputably true. To quarry, carve, and place the huge rocks, Ed used tools fashioned from old car parts taken from a nearby junkyard. Making such tools was an accomplishment in itself. Using them to create a stunning or to create stunning formations required a resourcefulness that borders on genius. To build his castle using these simple tools, he first would have dug down through the thin layer of topsoil and removed it, then used a saw or wedges to cut the brittle oolite rock, creating a trench around the piece he wanted. He then would use long steel wedges to get beneath the rock and pry it up, inserting smaller wedges to keep the stone raised high enough that he could wrap a chain beneath it. Slowly, he would begin raising the rock with the pulley inserting larger and larger wood blocks beneath the rock until it reached the surface, when he would place it on logs that would allow him to roll it where he wanted it to stand. Finally, he would use the pulley to slowly raise the stone, inserting wood blocks until the stone stood upright. It is worth keeping in mind, of course, that Ed's stones supposedly moved in such a manner that the stones. Okay, let me reread that. It is worth keeping in mind, of course, that the stones Ed supposedly moved in such a manner were as heavy as 30 tons. And that would be the equivalent of 60,000 pounds. Telling me this one guy moved to 60,000 pounds rocks with just wooden pulleys and all that. Come on. I really believe this is how he moved some of them, but not all of them. In fact, we're going to show the picture in the book now. The description says the tripod Ed used to help move the huge stones in Florida City. So that was actually at the first location. Not the final location, but the first location. And that some of these stones were as heavy as 30 tons. That part just doesn't add up. All right. We're almost done here. We got basically like a page left for today. And yet there are many who doubt the truth of this explanation. They feel that Ed, in describing the process by which he constructed Coral Castle, was deliberately misleading his neighbors, hiding the secrets he possessed, offering explanations that didn't tell the full story. They doubt that Ed's 10-ton hoist was capable of lifting the tallest and heaviest pieces of coral he quarried, and then moving and placing those pieces so precisely. Among those doubters are some surprising people. In April 1958, Civil Engineering magazine published a short article titled Projects of Florida Builder Baffle Engineers, written by a man named Carroll Lake. The article addresses the question of how Ed managed to achieve such results through standard engineering methods. Given that the magazine targets a readership of engineers, the article offers disappointingly little technical analysis, but does offer high praise for Ed's skills, noting, quote, the scarcity of stone chips shows he made no false moves and no mistakes, end quote. And that's a good point. Lake's evaluation of the rock gates, the stone entranceways Ed's constructed for his castle, is particularly interesting. Quote, the construction of these speaks volumes for the uncanny accuracy of Leedskalnin's engineering knowledge. He had to know the pivot points exactly, without guesswork or trial and error, and to hang the gates in perfect balance. The fact that the gates are of porous coral and uneven in density increase the difficulty of figuring the balance points. End quote. The gates, more than any other aspect of the castle, cast doubt on the theory of Ed's using only engineering skills and simple tools. How could he have balanced those gates so precisely while the chain-wrapped stone was suspended from a block and tackle? He may have been skilled enough to quarry such huge stones with his simple tools, but it's tough to imagine him using those tools to move the rocks into place so exactly that there was barely a seam between them, and then to balance the rocks so that they would swing with the slightest touch. When reading about the size and weight of the stones, it's difficult to believe one man, even a talented engineer, could do it alone. Standing next to them, it's nearly impossible. We have one more picture from the book for this chapter. It says Ed's place in the late 1920s. Ed used the wooden shack in the center as his living quarters during the years in Florida City. I actually really like this photo because what you see here, eventually he makes a two-story, what looks like a castle where he just is hanging out. And that tool shed that you just saw in the previous photo I was showing up here, that is the first level of his living quarters over at Homestead, where the Coral Castle is today. So that's it for today, chapters 2 and 3. And we went well over an hour, and I didn't plan on doing that, but it is what it is. AJ Wild, good to see you. Yeah, I'm here doing the Coral Castle deep dive. Glad to have you here. And I hope you're finding all of the past interviews interesting. I wanted to share a few more photos before we end today's stream. So this is what I was talking about. This is that first level of the living quarters. And the second level up here is where he would be living. And I think posthumously, somebody went in here and put these all of this between the blocks here. Because from what they were talking about with everything else, like very little room for error. All of these were precisely laying down. Here's the 360 view again. But like just this wall alone, I believe I have other photos. We'll see. Oh, this one's cool. There's an iguana sitting on top of Saturn here. See, like these stones that are stacked, more than just a few tons. Those things are massive. Not to mention these walls here. So this one's very interesting. This has, this was basically his calendar, his sun calendar. And apparently it is still accurate to this day. Let's zoom in here a bit. See, I'm glad I went here and visited and found found these high detail photos for all of you. So he had engraved all of this onto the stone, and then it looks like either he painted it or the people who came here to take care of this after painted it. But he did engrave all of these lines in here. It's very interesting how the spaces between each loop, especially like over here, they get shorter and shorter. And this is where the shadow would, like, this was basically his Like he put this piece up so that it would shine down to where we were just looking. So that tip sitting right there. I'd say that that's either 3 or 4 o'clock. Just an amazing feat. Okay, so this will be it for today. I don't want to share everything today. Keep it for the rest of the read through here. So we're about a quarter way through the book, but there's about 126 pages and then some photos afterward, some color photos. And we are on page 41. So got about 80 pages left. So that's what I was figuring about two more shows, and this should wrap it up for just this book. And then I also have, I think, two other like pamphlets that we could read through too that I cannot find anywhere else. I only found it at Coral Castle and Gift Shop. So we'll look through those after we're done with this book. And yeah, until then, this is the end of part two. I hope you all enjoyed it. And we will pick this back up next Tuesday with chapters 4 and 5. So I hope you all had a good time. I'll see you in the next one. We'll try to be doing another Madness Hour soon. And I got a few more guests lined up for interviews. So be on the lookout for that. Um, I still haven't figured out a way to pre-plan shows for Zoom through YouTube. So I've mostly just been setting up the Zoom shows and then going live off of that. So until the next one, thank you all. Hope you're all doing well and class dismissed.